imperfect verb, I had to look it up. History major. Sorry?
Is the word shall?
Not exactly, no. An imperfect verb is an action that starts in the past and continues, right? So, began to do X, right? So that's often used, but not universally used throughout it. So I'll describe that. And then, Ken, you were joking about this the other day, but the word "and" is actually very important when you read through Genesis chapter 1 in particular, because you can have two things happen simultaneously when you say "and," like these two things happen at the same time, or this happened and then that happened. And so understanding which is which is very important. The main scientific criticisms, as I said, 7 days, which means that evolution becomes problematic. It only happened in 1 week's time. And the birds. The birds are out of order according to what science would tell us in terms of when they first appeared. So, as we get into it, I'm almost ready to start. Thank you, Tom. I want to make clear, this is not, a lot of scientists say, well, you're just using God to explain the parts you don't understand. That's not what I'm doing here at all. I believe God was in all of this and continues to be, if you believe, permit me to use the imperfect tense. He began to create and is still creating, or making, I should say. So it's not a God of the gaps. And then the last thing that I'll say is, I think as Christians have tried to attack this, they've been too tame. And we were talking about this, Jonathan, this morning, about people being too tame with what we ask of God. And so that a lot of scientists that I've read about trying to explain creation and science, I said, well, we don't think that the Bible is really a scientific book, and we're not going to ask it to be that. I'm like, well, why not? This is God's Word. Why wouldn't God's Word describe how He did it, if He really did it? So I said, I'm not going to give Him a way out. No, I want His Word to be exactly right. And guess what? So one of the things that I discovered about 4 or 5 years into my foray here was this little verse that I love. This is what the Lord says: He who made the earth, the Lord who formed it and established it, the Lord is His name. Call to me, and I will answer you, and tell you great and unsearchable things you do not know. And I found this time and time again. I would get stuck on something, and I'd put it aside and say, I don't understand that. And then sometime between a couple days and a couple years later, God would put that in my way, and I'd be like, oh, that explains it. So I said, this was crucial to my walk. So now we're ready to start. Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, I'm going to use my own translation here. There are some actual of those 63, some do use the imperfect tense here. In the beginning, God began to create the heavens and then the earth. Oh. Now, there is a little bit of a gap here. I will say there's probably, if you're going to look from a scientific standpoint, there's probably about 10 billion years between the heavens and the earth. I'm not going to get into that. Jonathan, when I was in your church, we got into the theory of relativity. I'm not going to get into that. So the Big Bang would suggest, right, that everything came from nothing. And that is exactly what the verb create, or began to create, suggests. If you go back to the original Hebrew, it means, ex nihilo is the term we've always used from the Latin, from nothing. That is what that word means. It began to create. And there's as you go through and you look at Genesis chapter 1, when He says create or make or bring forth, it's always very, very on purpose. Very, very purposeful which verb is used there. And so create, the difference between creating something and making something, I always like to think about food. If I'm going to make you dinner, it could be as simple as putting something in the microwave, right? You're just following a recipe. It's not going to be that exciting a meal. But if I have a chef that's going to create something for you for dinner, you're probably in for a treat, right? Something that's never been seen before, you're about to have. So that's the same context that's used here. And I talked already about Newton's laws. So you may be familiar with some of the things that people, scientists today, have tried to theorize about to get around this idea that there was nothing before the universe came into being. It's a little problematic, I think. So we get to then the second verse, the first part of the second verse. And I'm not going to go through every verse, just so you know. The earth was, and this is in the past tense, not the imperfect tense, was without form. Meaning it was, I think, gaseous. And then it was empty. It was void. Right? Again, in the past tense. And then we skip, and then into the second part of verse 2. And the Spirit of God began to hover over the surface of the deep. Now, what does the Spirit of God look like? You remember from your book of Acts, it looks like tongues of fire, and I think maybe even lightning, and there's certainly a lot of wind involved, right? But, crucial verb there, hover, began to hover. This is a verb that's only used a couple times in the Bible. And it has this connotation of like a mother bird hovering over its eggs. And I thought, when I read that, I was like, if I'm trying to explain a single-celled organism to someone who has no concept of anything smaller than what he can see, wouldn't I use an egg to describe that? So, I believe that this is the Spirit of God forming the first single-celled organisms. I would suggest to you that God does not necessarily consider that life, because he talks more in Genesis about the animals and the things he's created that have the breath of life, right? So he's really more concerned about complex animals, in my opinion. So now we're going to skip ahead 3 days so we're skipping over the formation of dry land, the atmosphere, maybe in reverse order, and then the appearance of light in day 4 onto the earth. And we're going to go right to day 5. Then God said, let the water teem with living creatures, let the flying creatures fly above the earth and across the firmament, in the skies. So God began to create the great creatures of the sea, blah, blah, blah. So this word is slightly different than the one that's used in verse 1. It's still making something new, creating something new, but it has the connotation of using existing materials. So when you think about fish are, these first living creatures that can move around like real animals and so forth, very, very different than the plants that had existed before. So that you needed to use that word create. I believe what the author is going for here is that using existing materials, the first animals were used, perhaps that God used the plants that were available and made them into animals. That's my personal theory. So, create. Now, about the birds. And he says, be fruitful, multiply, flying birds. So, flying creatures is usually interpreted as birds. If so, that doesn't match the fossil record, because land animals show that it came before birds. However, if you say flying insects and flying fish, they did come before land animals. So this could be correct in that sense, right? And now we get on to day 6. That the land bring forth living creatures, and God made the wild animals. Using, now again, made versus create, and bring forth, connotation of bringing forth from one place to another. I think this is like bringing forth from the oceans to the land, the first creatures that walked on the land. And God made them from existing material. So evolution and microevolution and macroevolution are both described here. It says each according to its kind, which we know a human being can only ever have human beings as its offspring. A fish can only ever have fish as its offspring, and so forth, right? Same thing with the plants. The same phrase is used with the plants and with the fish, each according to its kind. So microevolution is change within a species. Macroevolution is when one species becomes another species. We have a good idea of how micro happens, right? Like, go back 100 years, the average height of a person was 3 inches shorter than it is today. It's microevolution, right? Small changes within a species. Macroevolution is if, in fact, one species became another species. Now they're two different things, right? They're two different, and they cannot mate. They cannot have offspring themselves. And they can came forth. And then we see some lovely pictures of things that kind of look alike. I like to think these were all kind of made by the same artist. And now we get to mankind. Now this is very interesting in my opinion. Let us make mankind in our image. So God created mankind. So is mankind made or created? The answer apparently is yes. Right? So we are created, we are different than anything else that exists in the world and in the universe. But we're also very similar to a lot of other things in the universe, right? And so I think this is amazing, the word choices in these sections. Every word is so precisely chosen. Now, mankind here in Genesis 1 is in the plural. Right? Man and woman, so we created both. And you've got time. So I kind of skipped over the day thing. Let me go back to that real quick. A day in Hebrew and in English can have 3 different definitions. Anybody help me? What's one definition of a day?
Sundown to sundown.
Yeah, 24 hours, right? Sundown to sundown. What's another? Daylight, right? From sunrise to sunset would be a day, right? Or there's this sort of vague thing where you might say something like, us old guys might say, well, back in my day, right? And it's a vague sense of what happened when. But if you get to the end of each day, it says, and there was evening and there was morning. So which of those definitions does that fit? From sunset to sunrise. It's not 24 hours.
It's half a day.
It's not the hours of daylight. What are we talking about here? So I think this is talking about some vague amount of time. There's also, as I mentioned, there's also the theory of relativity that can get into. I'm not going to go through that today. And then we get to the 7th day. He rests from all his creation. And I'm going to go into the second part of creation. Now, this is where things get a little bit complicated. How are we doing on time? Are you worried about this? I'm sorry. Okay. So no shrub had appeared in the field, and there was no man to work the ground. Then the Lord formed the man out of the dust. So if you read this in the traditional way, then this is Genesis 2 is thought of as being a sort of a subset of the 6th day of creation that's done in the 1st chapter. But I think that if you do that, there are a number of contradictions that show up. First, the man is created before plants and animals in chapter 2. Second, Adam and Eve's offspring murders their other offspring, and he's afraid of other people killing him. Who else is there? There's only his parents and his dead brother. So who's he afraid of people taking revenge on? And then he leaves, God forces him out, and he goes and marries somebody and starts a new city. It doesn't make sense, right? And then you've got this, so what I believe happened here is we should be reading Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 exactly as they're written. First, God created mankind, and then he created this specific man in this specific place. And then he made a wife for Adam, and they had children. And when their one child murdered the other one, off he went. And there was all these other people that he had already created in the first day, in Genesis chapter 1. And you see it here in Genesis 6. At the end he says, the Nephilim were in the earth in those days, on the earth in those days. And also afterward, and the sons of God went to the daughters of the Nephilim, had children by them. They were the heroes of old. Think about this. This was written in 1500 BC, and he's talking about people being old then, right? So I think he's talking about the people that were made or created in chapter 1. And if you read it that way, all of these other contradictions or apparent contradictions vanish. But there gets the problem of death and original sin. So, if people existed before Adam and Eve, what about death? Because throughout, especially Paul's writings, there's a lot about the sin and us being responsible, and Adam being responsible for us sinning. So it says in Genesis 2, God tells him, "You must not eat of any tree, of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat it in that day, you will certainly die." Will they eat from the fruit? Do they die in that day? No. They don't physically die, but they spiritually die, right? They get separated from God because of their sin. And that's what happens, by the way, to each of us. When we sin against each other, we break relationships, right? And you have to work to fix that relationship, or we become dead to one another, even though we're still alive. So Romans has the most succinct understanding of this, and for Lynn's suggestion, I added an extra verse in this. "Therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, in this way death came to all people, because all people sinned. To be sure, sin was in the world before the law was given." And the first law was don't eat from the tree, right? Sin is not charged to anyone's account where there is no law. That makes sense. If you don't know something's illegal, how can you know not to do it? Right? "Nevertheless, death reigned from the time of Adam to the time of Moses, even over those who did not sin by breaking the commandment, as Adam did." And then he goes back, going back a few chapters in Romans. "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities have been clearly seen, and some things we should all know are illegal, even if we don't know there's a specific law." And you can think of them, right? Murder, rape, incest, stealing from people. Like these things, you don't need to have somebody tell you those things are wrong, right? So some things we are responsible for, even if we don't understand what the law says, and some things we need to be told. Sorry about this. Okay, so what are some other explanations? I'm going to go through this quickly. The scientific explanations and the problems of science. Talked about the law of preservation and energy, matter and energy, the Big Bang, evolution, life. Every living being, every living species in the world can have evolved from something else, except the first one. And we have created RNA spontaneously from the muck, if you will, primordial ooze or some approximation of it. But we can't create a single-celled organism with DNA. And I think it's because there's this insoluble problem of you need a complicated cell that is so easy that can form by itself, but yet be complicated enough that it will self-create and also protect itself. So it becomes a problem in and of itself. And Darwin himself said that if the basic building block of life is complicated, then his theory of evolution breaks down. Well, it's pretty complicated, this we'll see in a second. And then Hawking, I'll talk about his thoughts about the fine-tuning. I love this. I'm just going to zip through this. Different other ancient explanations. You can see I'm just going to talk about my favorite one, the Hindu version. A giant turtle supports the earth and everything in it. And when the old man was asked, what was holding the turtle up, and he just says, "It's turtles all the way down." Okay, so I'm gonna zip through this. You guys can talk about something about this. Space is really, really big. How big? There's somewhere between 100 billion and 2 trillion galaxies. The universe is approximately 93 billion light years in diameter. Each galaxy has about 100 million stars. Our galaxy, our solar system rather, is about 11 billion miles. It takes 8 minutes for light to reach the Earth, 5.5 to reach Pluto, 4.2 years for light to reach from the universe. So space is really big. If you're thinking about like, there is no God, but we can just get along together, right? So space is really big, we're really small. How about, how old are we? The entirety of the length of time of the earth has been in existence versus human existence. If you hold out your arm, look at the tip of your fingernail, that's how long the entirety of humans have existed, is that fingernail from this. Or if you want another scale, on a 100-yard football field, the entirety of human existence is about the last inch. So we haven't existed all that long as an entire species. Forgetting about each of us as individuals. And then how many individuals are there? There are now 8.2. There's been about 20. But of course, if every species is equally valuable or invaluable, whatever the word is, then there are also 11 million species currently alive on the Earth. And how many billions of examples of those? So how small are we compared to all of that? And here's the Hawking quote. If any one of 40 different physical attributes was slightly different, then life would cease to exist. Stephen Hawking. And we get the complicated, so here's the beautiful thing. As complicated, as big as all creation is, that's how amazing each of us is. A newborn baby has 60,000 miles of systems, 1 mile of which is visible. How about that? Amazingly complex things that we walk around with. There are 30 trillion cells in the average human body, and the DNA from one human, stretched from end to end, is 67 billion miles long.
What?
So, here's the thing, and God made each one of us. So, the question comes, what is the simplest explanation? When Hawking looked at all this evidence, he thought the simplest explanation was there is no God. I'm going to show why I think he's wrong. Mostly because of what it says in the Bible. How did Moses know? If Moses was the one that wrote this down, this was written 1,500 years before Christ, well before any telescopes, well before any microscopes. He had no knowledge of any of the things that we've discovered in the last couple hundred years here. The Big Bang, he wrote about that. Life coming from inanimate matter, he wrote about that. The atmosphere being formed. Continental drift, he writes about that. Or the Bible talks about that. Plants being brought forth from the sea into onto dry land. All these things are all in Genesis. Mankind created and made. And then the contributions to Spirit. So, the Bible itself becomes, I think, scientific evidence that God made it all. So what? We talked about this before. Daryl, you and I were talking about this on the way here. How many people, especially writing from the time of Darwin to, say, about the mid-60s and on, these great Christian thinkers, and here's just a couple of them, who had faith in God despite the scientific evidence that was saying that there is no God. And they still were like, no, this is real. And that kind of faith, as I was walking through this, it was like, they had faith anyway. Read some of these people, their writings are fabulous. And then when you go back to the Bible, there are almost 1,200 chapters in the Bible, 2 of which are devoted to creation. I don't think God cares that much about that. What he cares about is the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And that is the most important part. So all the science and theology means nothing if what we're talking about here can't change your life. So indulge me for one more minute here, Philip. For many years, whenever I read John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God.
Yeah.
Sorry.
It's okay.
The Word was God. Why does John use the word to describe Jesus? What's going on here? And it's just bugged me for years and years. And I'm reading this book maybe 10 or so years ago now. And the author, this guy named D. Stanley Jones, who was on the previous page, explained it this way. It worked for me. Maybe it'll work for you if you already know Justin Tilden. He said, an idea can change the world, but you don't know what I'm thinking until I say it. I need to say something so you know what I'm thinking. This is how God, the Father, is.
Yeah.
We don't know what he's like until he speaks. We don't know what he's like until he appears. And I'm reading this, and it was like a thunderbolt. And I started crying with joy. It was so beautiful. Thank you for explaining this to me in a way that I can understand it. And so, that to me is Christ. He is the representation, the physical manifestation of God. If you want to know what God is like, look at the life of Jesus. Now, we go back to, obviously, John 1:1, very reminiscent of Genesis 1:1. Genesis 1:1 has a hidden Easter egg, if you will. Can I use that term here? To Jesus. In the beginning has several different definitions, one of which is this: through the firstborn, God began to create the heavens and the earth. And the Spirit of God moved over. In the first two verses of the Bible, there's the whole Trinity. I was like, whoa, blown away. Do you know who said this quote? I don't know if you know Bart Ehrman. He's a famous atheist. And he said, this is one of the most secure things that we know about anything in the ancient world. There's more written about Jesus that we know as a fact than anything else, even like who was emperor when Jesus was crucified. There are 4 times as many sources on Jesus as on Tiberius. How about that? The Spirit of God covered. Now, we're back to my Uncle Dean. About faith in action. This is philosophy. My Uncle Dean, as I said, had some health problems, one of which, of his many, was MS. He was confined to a wheelchair for 10 years at least. 3 times he went to a faith healer, twice nothing. The 3rd time he got up and walked. That's faith in action. That's the faith that can change your life.
Amen.